Bonjour, life sparklers, it's Claire. Welcome and thanks for listening to the Integrally Alive podcast, where we explore stories, wisdom, and tools for growing resilience and living your life in your own terms. Today, we will talk about the power of storytelling and especially writing, owning our stories so we are not owned by them anymore. Okay, my guest today started her career in marketing for technology startups in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. After a few close-to-death experiences, existential crisis, and tech burnout, she left tech to pursue her passion for meditation, yoga, and personal development. She has since spent her days obsessed with breathing, transitions, and learning how to navigate the complex theories and practices of this feeling we call life. She's coached and taught a blend of yoga and modern life coaching all over the world. And nowadays, she holds the podcast Movement and Meditate, and she is now working as a life coach and writing coach, helping entrepreneurs discover and write the books that live inside of them. And yes, if you listened to last week's podcast, you recognize Alice Speyer. Hi, Alice. I'm thrilled to continue the conversation with you today.
Hi, Claire. Thanks so much for having me again. It's a real pleasure.
Great. So last week, we discovered your story of resilience. And guys, if you didn't listen, I suggest you do, because it tells so much of Alice's why for doing what she does. And that's what we will talk about today. What this story of resilience is, how is this showing up in what Alice is offering to the world, because she's offering cool stuff. So we will talk about creative writing, storytelling, journaling, lots of things. And actually, maybe we can start with that. You're helping people to write about their story, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on with me right now as I'm starting to form this business, and it all leads up to a bigger vision of understanding how we have such creative minds of everyone, whether you believe you're a creative or an artist or not.
Yeah,
your mind is unique and beautiful and extremely creative. You're powerful beings who think and feel and do a whole series of complex tasks on a daily basis that we often take for granted. And so we're creating meaning and we're creating patterns, and we're being conscious to those meanings and patterns. And we can call these stories, we can call these events, we can call this truth or reality. At the end of the day, we're being very creative with how we express and how we understand the world as we see it. And through writing, whether journaling or using certain creative tools, like there's definitely prompts and different things that we can do through creative writing, whether it's writing your own stories or making up stories, that can really actually show you deeper and deeper levels to your own consciousness and how you're thinking, and seeing on the page certain things that you hadn't necessarily seen before, that you can then inspire I've seen it inspire anything from book ideas to business ideas to healing, or to acknowledging and recognizing some sort of element to, like, a closing of loops to past relationships or work traumas or just traumas in general. And it's quite fascinating to use that side of the brain, or that element of creativity, to really actually create and uncover and see something new within the stories or the meanings that we're telling ourselves.
And so there is so much in that already that we can go in so many directions. But one thing I'm really interested in is journaling versus creative writing, because you're helping people to tell their stories. So we would immediately think about, okay, we are going to journal, our stories. But you're using creative writing over journaling most of the time. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between the two and why creative writing is so interesting in that?
It's a very good question. And they're very similar, because you can journal in a creative way, of course, because you're just putting down your thoughts or talking about your day, or maybe your to-do list, or there's so many different ways to journal. And creative journaling or creative writing is something that accesses a different part, something you wouldn't necessarily normally do. So for example, writing, I think I mentioned this in the last podcast, but if not, it's like writing a poem about a word in a minute. Now that's using creative writing. It's not necessarily journaling.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also kind of thinking about what you're writing in a way for someone outside of you to understand. Whereas journaling is very personal. Creative writing, in essence, is, well, how do I make this understandable to, even if you never show another human being this, let's say you write out this creative in a creative way, and then you burn it or you throw it out. It's still 100% for you, but actively thinking in the way of like, how can I access my creativity to share this, to actually share this? And then when you reread it, it shows you something different, because it's like you almost coaching yourself in a sense, because you then you externalize yourself and your story to then teach yourself something about your story or what's going on for you, or what you're thinking and feeling in a different context. Does that make sense?
Totally. And it sounds like maybe it's helping to kind of understand your story, or taking different points of view, because that's the essence of creative writing, right? In journaling, you would say, I did that and I blah, blah, blah. And then creative writing, suddenly it can be, oh, so Claire woke up this morning. And so it's another person now. And I can allow myself to have different point of view, because then other characters can come in.
Exactly.
And so, yeah.
Exactly. And that's another technique and tool that I've been using as well, is basically take the story and write it in third person. Or like you said, Claire woke up today and realized that something really terrible had happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she felt this way. And even though you're talking so much about yourself, or you're writing about yourself, it shows you something different. Like there's just something that happens within the brain that allows you to see it and have more compassion toward yourself through that journey. And I've had even also in changing the name, you act as if this person, if this event happened to another person, it makes it a little bit easier to access certain feelings and emotions that could be hidden. And as we know, or maybe you've had other guests talk about this, that your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, if unexpressed, they will hide themselves in pain within the body, within your energy field, and it comes out some way or another. So accessing this in this way allows that energy to be released and at least understood. If not understood, at least released. So it's like, okay, you experience it fully, you have compassion toward it, and then it's released.
Yeah, it sounds like it could help. I mean, I'm sure it does actually help getting out some things that, as you say, whatever you keep inside, well, it shows up in another way. If you don't say it, it shows up in the body, like pains and illnesses and so on. And sometimes things are so big, it's so difficult to face, that it's actually not so easy to, I mean, there's a reason why we bottle down and we swallow up these things. So creative writing sounds like a good way of taking distance, not to hide from this, but actually to be able to get it out in a safe way.
It becomes like a 1 degree of separation. So it's still connected to you, or it's putting on a different pair of glasses. You're just changing the sunglasses basically. And the interesting, because we all love stories. I mean, this is why we have entertainment and plays and theater and books and movies and TV shows, because we see other people experience and feel what they're experiencing and feeling, and we get to kind of quote unquote live their lives through their own lens. And so if we can do that to ourselves and just have that 1 degree of separation, it's like, well, now this person, this trauma or whatever you're experiencing, or event or thing to be processed, you can start understanding it from a different perspective and having more words and more thoughts and feelings associated with these events of your life. And it's fascinating how easy it is for us to have compassion for something outside of ourselves.
Yes.
And when it's truly meant to be directed at ourselves. So when we kind of have that just first step of separation in a healthy, reflective way, using our own creativity, it becomes very powerful. You take ownership over it. Actually, you start feeling like you have more control over the events in your life. And because it's a fact that we're intelligent, creative beings. It's just a 100% fact. And so we can acknowledge and accept that fact of ourselves when we can externalize these events just slightly, just enough for us to see a different perspective.
Yeah, I love that. Just enough. And yeah. It sounds also, I mean, I like the way that writing also can help creating meaning about the stories. And I'm thinking a lot about our interview last week, where you had such an interesting story of having gone through something and then trying to make sense of it afterwards, and how writing helped you to see that. So in a way, writing can also maybe not only help things come up, but also make sense of, and maybe giving a new sense of about this story in a creative way. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. One of the things that another technique that's extremely useful, especially if you're in a heated kind of emotion of it, sadness or anger, is to over-exaggerate it. Make yourself 100% right.
Yeah.
He was an asshole. Can you believe this person? Just blow it out of proportion and give yourself that validation that yes, you're 100% right. And these are all these things. And then you have that out there, allow yourself to express it. You externalize it just slightly, right? It's third person. Like, can you believe this? And then you start seeing something, because now you have to write the conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Especially if you're writing the conversation. He said this, she said that, or I said that. If you want to then take it back to yourself and really put the he said, she said in context, right? Because now you have to understand how this other person felt. Like if let's say in a very bad argument with a partner, let's say you over exaggerate your husband and say that, you know, he threw something at you, even if he never did. Like you just add stuff and add layers to it, and then you realize, oh, actually now what really happened, and oh, I can see from this, like maybe he came home after our son yelled at him or something like that, or something different happened, and there's a different perspective. But without releasing that emotion, without over exaggerating it and allowing yourself to over exaggerate it, now it's confined and contained. It's like, it's done. Instead of having what we often do, at least I've definitely done this before, is just repeat the same story and get caught in it and looking for extra validation from myself, from others. Like, right, it's bad that this happened, right? And it's like, okay, yes, and what happens next? Like, contain it, right? And this can be really, really difficult, especially if you go into deeper traumas like rape or even other like abuse or addiction, and you get caught in that story where you're looking like, it's right that he did this, this is bad. It's right that this is bad. Sorry, like that I'm no longer a victim. I'm a survivor. This, that, and the other. But when you allow yourself to write it out and see all of the feelings and emotions that are possible there, then within yourself, then you no longer need that to justify that, because in no context, at least one that I've seen, is rape or abuse a good thing. So, but our minds kind of constantly want to look at that because we're trying to justify certain feelings we have. Well, then if I know this is a bad thing, then why do I feel such guilt and shame? Well, then the question becomes, is that a really positive, is that a question that's serving your highest good? Well, perhaps writing a story about it, like actually using creativity to reframe or recraft that story, or really look at it from a different way, or let's see, where is the context of guilt and shame coming from? And you'll only see it after you've written it. That's the funny thing. It's like, oh, but it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. That's what I love. It's like revealing something. So you have this story, whatever you have inside of you, and putting it out, being by just storytelling or writing, it helps you to see it for what it is, and to maybe for the first time really see it in all this glory and entirely. And I love what you say about putting an end. Like when you write a story, you literally put an end to the story. At some point, you decide, okay, this is the end. So I love this idea of doing that for personal stories and deciding, okay, this story is now has ended and I'm making space for new stories.
Yes.
I'm allowing myself to have new stories that can be totally different from this one.
Yes. And there's something powerful that happens. It's quite painful. Like, it's not always easy to write this. You kind of have to trust the process, and and knowing that once you finish the writing of it, and maybe it takes a couple of tries too, like, there will be some kind of release for sure. You will get some sort of insight, even if that insight is like, I don't know why, but I feel kind of better now. And I'm not ready to reread this or look at this. And that's okay too. And you can end that story and make space both mentally, physically, and even energetically for new events, not necessarily new stories, just new experiences to show up in your life. And it can even change and shift your perspective of what is good and what is bad, because then you take it in a relational element. Well, what is good and bad for me right now, as opposed to in general and forever. And it makes it a lot easier to navigate and negotiate. Which is another creative.
I totally don't like these bad and good and bad things, because people get really caught into that. And for me, it's always a matter of nothing is bad or good inherently. I mean, really, if you look into it, it's just at this moment, is it serving you or is it limiting you? And from that, then you can reframe everything. And I think writing these stories helped you seeing that, okay, I felt this negative in the moment, but then actually it brought up new things that were good. So, I mean, that were positive for me and making it expand. So, and I love it makes me think about something you said last week. We are so much stronger than we think we are. And I think writing the story helps us to see that, to actually not only make sense, but also acknowledge what's happening or what has happened, and maybe also celebrate, because we are so good in seeing why we feel bad about the story, or how we could have behaved better, or how we failed. But then it maybe helps us to see the other half of the story. Hey, I met that. Or if it's a terrible story of trauma and abuse, and well, I'm still alive and I'm coping with it, and I'm still having, a life and so on. So it helps maybe seeing our strengths as well.
Yes. It's very, very difficult for us as humans to understand why we are here and make sense of what has happened and what is yet to happen. And we want to have that certainty and sense of control. And yet this is where, the good and bad comes in. It's like, well, is it good? Is it bad? We will never know. We will never, ever know. And certain things, I mean, if you listen to last week's episode when I was sharing my story, is it bad that I drank too much alcohol and went to the hospital and had just incredible challenges with my family and etc.? Maybe at the time, it was awful and bad and it didn't feel very good. Yet now, if I hadn't gone through that, then I would not have the wonderful, beautiful relationship that I have with my family right now, because we really deeply needed to look at that stuff, and we were confronted. We were in a place of our lives, all of us, where we had no choice but to confront this. And if it perhaps, I don't know, it's all hindsight and speculation, perhaps if that hadn't have happened, then we wouldn't have gone through the deep vulnerability required to actually have the difficult conversations required to have the amazing friendship and relationship that we have now. Now, it's not always easy, but now we definitely have that connection to where we're not afraid to hurt each other. Obviously, there's no malice there, but we're not afraid to hurt each other just based on who we are. And that story, even now, and I remember as I was telling you last week, that it's changed and evolved so much for me. I'm still learning from that story. And every time I think about it, every time I write it, now it's beyond writing. Now I'm more comfortable in sharing it, because it's so not me now that I get to crack it open a little bit more. Oh, like, well, maybe I was a bit of a brat. I don't know. It's not me now. And maybe I could have used a bit more pressure and encourage, like to do better in school or in life or what have you. I don't know. But the interesting thing is now I'm in a stage of curiosity. And after
Yes.
writing about it over and over and
Yes.
over again, it keeps me in that stage of what am I learning and what does this tell me about myself now? And what does this tell me about other patterns that I possibly didn't see now? And what positives came out of it. Like I mentioned, my relationship with my family is so much more deep and enjoyable as a result of that. So
I
you
love,
never know.
I love it. You know, it's exactly what happens when you begin to see whatever happens as a story, then you begin to be curious about that. And it allows so much things to unfold, as before you're just trying to find a meaning and why is it happening to me and why did I do that way. But when you step back, I mean, for me, writing is a kind of stepping back and noticing and observing. And there it becomes, okay, what is going to happen to this character now? And there's a lot of curiosity and there's a lot of play. And I would like you to talk a bit about play, because I know you're using a lot of play in your workshops. And I'm using a lot of play as well. And I believe this is an absolute key to healing. Like, let's get a little bit less serious, guys.
Absolutely. Before we go into that, you
Yes.
did. I want to highlight and actually acknowledge you for something you did mention, because I fully agree with this. We get into these moments of like, why did this happen to me? And you have personal growth is what's happening for you, and that's not always a helpful thing to
changing. Yeah.
But changing the question, as you had so very beautifully and eloquently said, is like, well, yes, why does this happen to me? Sure, okay, but is this really helpful? Is this serving me? What actually happened? Now you're writing about it. Now you're back in that, well, what did happen? What do I know? And then you can go back to why. But you only know what, you'll only understand deeper and deeper levels of that why if you go through the painful, sometimes enjoyable process of kind of writing out what happened, who was there, when did this happen, how did this happen? Oh, maybe there's a why somewhere embedded here that I can't see. And maybe the why doesn't even matter.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I just love that. Yeah, sometimes the why doesn't really matter. And it can even change over time. But just.
Exactly. And this is where we can get playful. So when we get to the point, maybe why doesn't matter. And well, how can we make fun of this, or how can we make light of this instead of fun of it? Because one of the creative tools that I mentioned earlier is to take a story and over-exaggerate it. And this is really good for comedy and improv. And I think you were saying last week in our conversation, the yes and.
Yes,
yeah. And this is how we can then really act out or embody our stories and play with it. And it's like, well, what if he was yelling at me, but he had a fly nearby him and he's constantly swatting at this fly, and this is making him angrier and angrier. Make some comedy out of it. Or what can we put some mystical element? Or let's say there's a dinosaur that walks in. What would happen now? Or just play with it, because then this is where we get kind of more curious in creating different versions of this story. Or say, like, let's say these aren't people whatsoever. Let's say they're ants. And now the ants are arguing because the female ant forgot to buy the bottle of wine for the dinner tonight. And it's like, okay, then you're starting to think, well, do ants drink wine? Can they even open a bottle of wine? And it kind of gets your mind thinking in something completely different, makes it play. Or another tool, this is actually quite fun, or at least I think it's fun, is to turn it into a children's story. Make it understandable for children. And this can be quite scary, especially if you're dealing with traumas and healings and stuff that you really don't want children to know. Or we want to protect our children from this kind of stuff. And yet that same protection might actually be not super beneficial. We don't really know. And yet when we turn it and oversimplify the language, then we can see it in another way as well, and just have fun with it. And not everything has to be serious. It doesn't have to be a children's story about a serious trauma. It can be a children's story about, don't know, the trigger that your colleague at work had said something, and for some reason that really irritated you, and it wasn't a really big deal, but you're still thinking about it 2 days later. Things like this. And this is really useful for how you can start collecting stories. There was this joke, I guess it's a joke, an inside joke, if you will. I don't know if it'll be super funny now, but when really weird or bizarre or random things would happen to me or a friend or us in a group when we were traveling, to make light of the situation, we'd just be like, well, it's fodder for the novel. So one day I will write a book about my life because I live an interesting life, and this story will be so interesting in that novel. Like, oh, the time I lost my bag in an airport in Spain, and like all these nuances or different annoying things. And you just kind of like, well, there's going to be an interesting story on the other side of this. You never know. And when we start looking at our scenarios or life as stories, as we're living them, it can become more fun. Like, oh, what's the possible outcome now? Maybe the man of my dreams comes and rescues me off of this mountain and has somehow my suitcase from the airport, or however you want to look at it. Or maybe the next business opportunity comes along, or I find the exact dress that I wanted to wear for speaking on stage and I hated all the clothes that I brought with me. And or you never know what goes on and what ends up happening, but we start creatively thinking of newer and newer ways in a much more positive, playful way to allow space for new experiences, again, instead of stories, experiences to show up in our life.
Yeah, I love that, collecting stories. Seeing it unfold in your life. And because lots of time when something happens and we are not quite okay with that, we think it's the end. It's like, oh no, and we feel stuck. And we actually have difficulties to project ourselves, like you say, the other end of the tunnel or on the other side. And it can feel sometimes like, oh God, this is going to start forever. But putting this in the perspective, hey, this is a new story I'm collecting and I can choose the end. So what could be the end? What are the options and which one do I want to choose? And this is so much more powerful. So I love the play between, okay, there is creative writing on paper, but then you can totally take that in your life, in your daily life. That's huge.
It's a practice. You're building a muscle of telling the story of your life. And if you think back to, I'll go with university because people tend to like university more than they like school, right? Your favorite teachers or professors or even mentors or all the people who inspire you. It's 99% of the time, it's because they were telling stories. And that's how you learn the valuable lessons. You're not going to learn from step 1, do this, step 2, do that. I mean, you can push yourself to learn, but our minds are trained. We release dopamine. We release these drugs in our brain that makes us feel good when we approach something new with novelty. And this is where learning is exciting. And learning is actually meant to be exciting. And it's meant to be exciting because we're supposed to be connecting and learning from each other. You look at puppies, for example, or kittens, like young animals, and how they play. Like puppies will, tease each other, bite each other. They're play fighting because they're training how to actually take care of themselves in the real world. And they're not trying to hurt you, even they'll bite you, and they're just playing and they're just basically putting their mouth on you and testing, like understanding, figuring you out, like, how are you going to react to this? Let me learn from this. It's new, it's novel because every reaction is different. And so we have these triggers in our brain. And so when we when we listen to these stories, we're like, wow, we feel an emotion and it connects to us. And when you're in that space of connection and emotion, and when you're able to start creating stories in real time, now you're getting into manifestation. Whether you believe in the science or art behind it is irrelevant, because you are actually in essence creating things, whether you believe the energy of it or when you're actually actively creating something with your hands or your physical body. And it's very, very fascinating, because when you get in that space of emotion and creating your stories and creating your life, you're now in the driver's seat and you're now feeling and experiencing life and acknowledging each emotion for what it is, which is an emotion informing you of something.
Yeah, that's really important. It's so easy to get caught in the emotions and thoughts and so on. And it actually made me think about Henri de Montfred. He was a navigator. He's the kind of man who had 10 lives in one. And so someone was asking him, he was quite famous at some time. He wrote some book in France. And a journalist asked him, so how come you have such an adventurous life? I mean, how do you find all these adventures? And Henri de Montfred was like, well, I'm not seeking adventures. I mean, basically, adventures are moments that suck, that you don't want to. You do everything you want and you can to avoid them. But then afterwards, they make really good stories. And I love the way you can put that back into place and realize at the moment where you're living that, hey, that's an adventure. It will be a very good story. And I can change the end. Okay, there is something I feel like many people will react like, well, okay, well, you're having this great life. I mean, you're living in Bali, Malaysia, you're traveling, you're meeting good people. You have a lot of stories to tell. I don't have a story. Are you having these kind of reactions a lot in your writing workshops and so on with your clients?
Yes. And even, it's funny, I was actually talking about this today where I was asking a friend, I was like, oh, tell me a story. I'm being playful. I was like, I want to hear stories because it's kind of become an obsession of mine. And she's like, yeah, I know, like, you're really good at this and you have stories, but I don't really have stories. And I was like, well, isn't that a story? She's like, no, it's not a story. Okay. Well, tell me why you don't have stories. She's like, well, my brain doesn't operate that. And she starts telling me the story, why she doesn't tell stories and why she doesn't like it. I was like, oh, you don't see that this is a story. She actually couldn't at the time see it. And it wasn't the right moment for us in that conversation. Later we ended up talking about it and it's like, well, you just don't think it's a story.
Yes.
Call it something else. It's only, we have a tendency to think it's a story because we're a little kid. Oh, it's story time. Like, I'm going to learn something. Someone's going to tell me something. It's going to have some interest or excitement or, wow, I heard this inspiring story. We have labels, judgments, and associations to the word story. So I haven't quite figured out the right word. I'm still working on it. But if we remove the word story and we just ask, well, what's on your mind right now? Or what's going on for you right now? Or what happened? Or how did you feel when that person said that? Or what would you do if you were me in this scenario with getting pulled over by a police officer? Like, what would you do in that scenario? How would you think of it? Now you're inventing if I were in your shoes. Everyone at some point in their life has said, well, if I were in your shoes, I would do this. And so we're able to project ourselves and we're able to have judgments, and not all judgments necessarily have to be bad. It could be an inspiring story. That's a label. That's a judgment or a belief around that story. Or I don't have a story. That's also a judgment. Now you get to go back to choosing something you said earlier. Is this serving me or is this not? So let's say, write a story. What I've been telling you, like, tell me a story about someone who doesn't know how to tell stories.
I love that. Or
who doesn't have a story to tell. Now you have basically, I mean, I don't know why this just popped into my head, but I think I don't think it's Dr. Seuss, but there's a story called, a little kid story called Are You My Mother? And it's about this little bird that goes around and asks a rock, are you my mother? You do the same with your story. Are you my story? Like, what's the story? Like, what is this telling me? You just keep asking yourself the question, what? And then when you're in a moment, if you can start training your brain, it's really, really difficult, but it is possible to train your brain to say, oh, what's the story here behind this? What's the meaning? What am I telling myself? What? And then you can start asking, like, what does this mean to me? Is there something else that I'm thinking about is why I'm feeling this way because of what this person said? Does this remind me of something? Now you start uncovering the story. The word story is absolutely irrelevant. Story is something that we put on top of things when it's all nice and put into a really beautiful package. And now I can present myself to the world. No, it doesn't work that way. The best stories are the messy ones, right? we go to, this is why we have action movie after action
Yeah,
movie,
that's what
right?
I was going to say. These are the ones we go to see in cinemas. There's a reason why. It's always like something bad happens in every movie. If not, it's boring to us and we don't even go. Yeah.
We don't even go because it's too normal. And the reason why we don't want to go to those stories or hear them or watch them, it's because they're unrelatable. Unrelatable. And yet when we take the lens to ourselves, it's like, oh, well, I don't have any stories. It's like, well, that's not true. You're just calling it something else. You want it to be something that it's not. You have a judgment or an idea of what is a good or bad story. And yet there's a block there not allowing you to be that relatable, vulnerable, authentic person. And it's really, really tough. Part of the reason why I'm like kind of have this obsession about it is because it was extremely difficult for me to be vulnerable and tell stories. I wanted to package stories and tell them for comedy or to make light of things. I didn't want to tell things that were actually happening with me and how I was thinking and feeling. Even now. And so I'm pushing myself in this challenge. We teach what we need to learn ourselves.
Yes.
So I'm pushing myself in this challenge of, well, what's the meaning and what's the story behind this for me? And can I actually go through what this perceived pain, I say it's painful, it's not real pain, of sharing a story or what I'm going through now or recently with the people that I'm speaking with and seeing what comes up. And I've learned fascinating things, not only about myself, but about the people who are like, oh my God, you're not the only one. I really hate that. That reminds me of this one time 7 years ago. And now we're having a real conversation. Now I'm really getting to know what's behind this colleague who's always working so hard, but actually is battling some guilt and shame from her past that somehow me sharing what I'm going through now has helped her see a different side of her own story. And now we become connected and powerful and beautiful and really share in that experience. Now we're in the movie, the powerful movie that we want to watch.
Yeah. No, it's so true. I mean, this is something that's so deep in my work. Every time you share this a story, and often if it's an intimate story, it's one you don't want to share because you attach so much meaning on that. And oftentimes you think you're the only one. Or, yeah, basically it always comes back to, oh, yeah, no one can understand or relate, or I'm the only one having that, and it's better for me to shut up and hide this story so I'm not rejected, or etc. And then, yet, when you guide people to share these stories, then it's like, oh, everyone is coming up and saying, oh, yeah, that is so me. I can totally relate to what you're saying because me, I have, and actually it's like everyone is just standing, side to side, shutting up, saying, oh, I hope they never get to learn my story. But everyone is like secretly, they just want to share it because it's how we connect as well. And we can recognize ourselves in each other. And actually it makes me think it would be really interesting to hold a workshop together, like first maybe writing your story for yourself, and then I go into storytelling and sharing it in with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to
That
do
would
that
be great. Yeah,
that would be amazing. And it's super fascinating because we forget that the movies or these stories or people who tell them, they've told them over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And they've shaped them and craft them and learned from them and see lessons from them. And we were talking earlier about the dopamine release in the brain where it's the novelty. It's the same with vulnerability, sharing that because now you're learning. You're in the state of learning. And when you shape, then once it's out of you, then you can, like you were saying, shape and craft and retell the story, recreate it, decide what to do with it. You can, I don't like this word, but using it for the sake of this is like manipulating it, like a wad of clay. You're turning it into something that actually can serve you in a better way. And it's quite fascinating. It's quite fascinating what people come up with. And this is how it started for me also with kind of getting deeper into my creativity. I just finished the first draft of my fiction novel, which will be coming out next year.
Yay!
And which is still wildly insane to me because it was a childhood dream that I've never been able to realize, and now it's actually happening. And it started from pain. I was I was living in my perspective of the city had changed. I was living in Kuala Lumpur, and when I first arrived, I was like, this city is ugly and I'm so happy. And then it became, a city is ugly and it's gray and I don't like it. And I just miss colors in my life. And like, I wish I could just see more colors. And then I started writing a story about this character who could see colors that weren't there. And it was completely delusional. And I started writing the story. And then another day I was like, oh, like, I feel like I'm burning the candle at both ends. I just want to dig my own grave. It's just one of those days. Like, oh, I just want to just get it over with, like dig my own grave, not bother anyone. And then it's like, oh, that's interesting. What if there was someone who actually believed this, who actually wanted to dig their own grave? And now I have these two characters, and they kind of have this really unique storylines and how they go through their own personal growth journey and spiritual awakening, or through what they learn, and starts out with this exaggeration that's a really human emotion. And it's like, everyone's felt that level of embarrassment or that level of shame where you're just like, I just want to die right now. And we don't actually mean that. Yet, what if we exaggerated that and played with that? What would that look like? And you just keep asking yourself that creative question of what. And once you get the story out, you can start reshaping it. You can start telling it over and over again, and you'll never know what comes out. Like, this is what I said earlier. Business ideas, book ideas, how you want to show up in the world, how you want to start actually treating yourself and others, how you want to start serving. Maybe your story of your rape trauma or whatever trauma you're experiencing now can help that other person who's 10 steps behind you, who could really understand and truly feel and embody that she's not alone, and that it's okay for him to cry because it's painful. And it's okay that this happened because you're still here and you're still able to create and write and move on in your own pace, as slow as humanly possible.
And going back actually to something you said, because there's two things actually in what we're just discussing now. There is, okay, everyone has a story, and the mere fact that you're alive in your day, you already have millions of stories. I mean, that's what creative people do, like photographers or writers or comedians. They take a tiny detail and they make it in a story. And we really don't realize how much we live and how much of that we have, and actually how much of a storyteller we have, because every day and every moment, as soon as we communicate to someone, and actually that someone can actually be us as well, we are making up a story. We are saying something and we are kind of hallucinating on it. Like, I don't know, you're seeing someone and he's smiling and you're like, oh, he's really happy now. You don't know why he's smiling, actually. Maybe he's just remembering a memory, and it has nothing to do with this present moment. But we are putting projections on everything. So we are making up stories all the time, and we are storytelling all the time. As soon as we meet someone and we begin communicating, that's storytelling. So
absolutely,
it's interesting that while we are doing that, and that is happening, first we don't really recognize that, and we make it such kind of a specialist act to write or to tell a story. Like, oh, I have to be an artist to write. Oh, I'm not a writer. But we are all writers. It's really interesting to me what you're doing in the dramatizing the act of creating.
It's fascinating. I mean, I've worked with people who they don't want to write. It reminds them of school, and they can't do it. And they're like, yeah, I'm not creative in this capacity. And it's like, okay, so what if we tried? And then we tried and it still doesn't work. And it's like, okay, cool. Send me audios. I'll write your story. So I got some audios. I wrote their story, and they're like, wow, no, it's not like this. And then they started writing. Oh, look, you're writing. And they're like, no, but it's not the same. I needed you to do it. And I was like, okay, maybe, sure. However, the truth of the matter is that you are now writing your story. Maybe you needed the help. Okay, you and everyone else on the planet needs some help. So accept yourself as the beautiful human you are, and thank you for allowing me to to kickstart you on your story. And it's super fascinating how it's a survival mechanism, really. When you're a baby or a child and you have it's a goo goo gaga, blah, 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 you have no way of actually communicating. Yet your brain is connecting patterns and dots. Oh, okay. If I fall down and make a noise, then all the adults are going to get upset and I cry, right? You've seen kids fall down and they don't cry. They just move on and go out because there's meaning on it, right? Or they realize, oh, okay, let me put everything in my mouth because they're tasting, they're testing, they're censoring, like, what is this world that I've just been ejected into and what meaning do I put on it? And this is where I'm not the expert on child psychology or anything else, but I have heard that before the age of 5, the first 5 years are really, really important because those are the communication years, right? You're learning how to communicate through sound and screaming and crying and body language. It's the only way you know how to communicate is by screaming. And then you start learning other methods of communication. And we forget that writing, once we learn how to write, that's another form of communication. Now we have all these tools: body language, actual language, facial expressions, which is a form of body language. It's I put it different because it is very different. Then you have sound, like not even language, like grunts and onomatopoeias, like this type of stuff. And then you also have the written word and even gibberish, like fake languages and other languages that you speak if you're bilingual or trilingual. And there's so many different forms and methods of communication. Even the way you dress, your clothing is a form of communication. And we forget all of this. We're communicating constantly because we're tribal creatures needing to communicate. This is why traffic signs all across the world, and believe me, I've been to quite a lot of the world, they're the same. Green means go and red means stop. Yet we can't understand the language that this person is verbally speaking. We understand the traffic signs. And sure, we can say like there's crazy drivers everywhere. However, but basic signs is there's universal communication. And you'll only be able to get there by learning and expressing the forms of communication that you're best in, and not even best in. You're crafting that skill and learning more about it, even if it's just for you. Just like the person who gave me audios and all of a sudden started writing a book because they needed to know that they had that still in them. We forget, or we're here to remember what we already have within us, which is a very unique and interesting ability to communicate through multiple media.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinating with this idea, and I mean, and what we made it in the world today. Like you have to be a singer to sing, you have to be a dancer to dance, and how we all, as children, we never ask ourselves, oh, can I dance? No, I'm not a dancer. I don't know how to dance. You hear the music and you dance, and all your family is there and watching how you're dancing, and you don't care. You just don't care at all. And then somewhere we just lose that, and we take it so seriously that it's a bit sad to me, and it's something I always love to kick back in the life of people. Like, hey, you're a dancer. You don't know it. Yes. The only difference is you just don't know it, but you're a dancer, you're a writer, yes. You're a storyteller, and I'm going to remind you. So, love that.
I had no idea that I was a writer. I had completely forgotten. And now it's funny because most of the last more than a decade, when people would ask me what I studied in school, no one believed me. They thought, oh, for sure, business or finance or marketing. No, I studied poetry. And now I can say, yes, what I'm doing is actually in line with what I wanted to be doing to begin with. Which is writing.
Yeah.
At last. Then I started learning from family members, oh yeah, you were always writing when you were a kid. And it's like, I was? And they're like, yeah, we didn't understand what you were doing, but you were certainly always like had a crayon or pen writing something. I was like, oh, so I was, now I'm, because I used to say, oh, all these people who said, yeah, ever since birth, I was doing this is what I was meant to do. And I don't have that. And now it's like, oh, I guess everyone does. It's just takes some time to remember. And yeah, it's pretty cool. Like, it's pretty cool to just all of a sudden realize it was such a surprise to me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm a writer. I just wrote a book. And friends who've known me for more than 10 years, they're like, yeah, of course you did. And it's interesting. And so we have and everyone has this. Everyone is a writer, whether they're actually destined to be novelists or not. They're a writer. We stop listening to each other. We start having judgments. Oh, I can't dance. I'm not a dancer. Oh, I can't do this. Like, as we age. And when you start really, how this came up for me was listening. I decided to do a thought experiment, and every person I encountered, I decided to just say as little as possible. And I heard the most boring stories ever. And I also heard, after the most boring stories ever, the most real, raw, authentic, surprising, shocking, incredible, inspiring stories. Fascinating stuff. I was like, wow, like I didn't even know this person had this in it. And it always ended with, I don't know why I ended up telling you that. And the pattern that I found was because they truly felt listened to.
Yeah.
So if you allow this opportunity to yourself, listen to yourself and allow yourself to just write, even if it's bad, even if because only you think it's bad.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I would listen to some of these people. Sure, if I had to listen to quote unquote 40 minutes of commercials in order to get to that 10 minutes of real, juicy, amazing, interesting story, it never was 10 minutes, actually, probably an hour, for sure. Absolutely, sign me up. So.
Well, that's cool. That's so juicy. I mean, we could go on for like forever with this conversation. There's so much in that, but we're ending this conversation. I want to end with this, with a question I usually ask everyone, and I didn't ask it in the last interview, so we are going to do it now. And but you actually kind of answered that just now. But what makes you feel alive?
Oh. That's a very good question. There are a lot of things that make me feel alive. Right now, it's really unique. It's stories. It's good conversation. When I started looking at everything as stories, it started helping me feel more alive. And what I really love is actually the art of listening to people's stories, because everyone has such a fascinating take on the world. And the minute I start checking myself and my judgments or my opinions and start truly listening, I notice I start feeling more and more alive, because the conversation gets richer and richer, and it allows me to express myself in a completely different way. And it's really great for me to go back to the other thing that makes me feel alive, which is writing and journaling and understanding more and more about myself and how I'm not so different from everyone else. And then everything becomes interesting. If someone's like, hey, you're working too hard, take a break. And I'm like, no, I love this, or yeah, perhaps I should. And I look up and I'm in beautiful Bali. It's like, oh, this is interesting. This is an interesting part of the story. That time where I was working too hard and needed to take a break. And now I'm looking outside at this rice field with these chickens screaming their heads off. And now and it's the little details that make you feel alive. And it's those little details that have us hang on to stories. And so it becomes an adventure. Adventure makes me feel alive, and travel and really understanding what this world is about. And I understand best, just like everyone else, is through stories and through other people's lives, because we have other people on this planet, so we can experience and understand things in ways that we could never experience and understand in our own bodies. So helping other people see and express their stories, that's something I feel the world truly needs, is more experiences of the world, more models of how to live an inspiring life.
Yeah, wow, I relate 100% to that. I just love, sometimes I say I'm a student of life and I'm a student of people. I just love hearing people telling their stories, because there is so much. They don't realize how much we learn from each other, and there's always something that will help someone else in whatever your life is. There is always something that will help someone else in that. So yeah, totally relate to that. Okay, wow, that was a super great conversation, and I feel it could go on for hours still. But we're going to wrap up for today. Maybe we'll see you again on the podcast someday. That could be cool.
I would love to come back. Absolutely. I always enjoy talking to you, Claire.
And so you guys make sure you check Alice's work on on Facebook. You will find her on Alyse.Speyer, and it's written ALYSE.SPEYER, Alice Speyer. And of course, you will find the link on the show notes for this episode on the website integrallyalive.com. And that's the end of this episode. Thank you, Alice, so much for being with us today, sharing your treasures.
And you can also find me on Instagram at Told by Alyse.
Oh, right.
And that's also another avenue to get in touch with me, as I'm still kind of crafting my website up. And yeah, it was so wonderful to be back here and really good to have this conversation. Hopefully it was valuable for you listeners. Please feel free to get in touch with me with any questions. I'd be more than happy to hear more of your stories.
Yeah, I'm sure it was interesting for everyone, like really. So thank you everyone for listening. And if you like what you hear, check the website integrallyalive.com for the show notes and leave a comment. I love reading your feedbacks. Subscribe to the podcast and rate it on iTunes. You will help more people get access to this information. Till next time, and until then, keep sparking life and going from alive-ish to alive. Bye, à bientôt.